Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, dear audience, I want to give you a very warm welcome to our panel with the title Building Resilient Democracies, Strengthening Civil Society to Counter Autocratization Tendencies. It is already day 3 of this conference of the IACC, and it does have the headline Confronting Global Threats, and we have heard so much already. As global threats, democratic backsliding and corruption, of course, have been mentioned as 2 of the main global threats that we should confront as a community and especially as the anti-corruption community. With this panel, we want to contribute to this discussion from a very specific angle. But before diving into the content of the panel, I want to first tell you a little bit on a bit more context of how this panel came together, and especially how our focus on this topic is as GIZ. The German Development Corporation, which is the GIZ, works on behalf of the German Ministry for Development, which is the BMZ. The BMZ made corruption and integrity a quality criterion of the German Development Corporation. The corresponding quality criterion strategy was published 2 years ago in 2022. And this strategy aims to systematically integrating the fight against corruption and the promotion of integrity in all its aspects of the German Development Corporation measures. It not only aims to contribute to mitigating the harmful impacts of corruption, but more broadly to promoting sustainable development. For us at GIZ, this strategy guides our work in all its aspects and builds the principal policy framework of our projects. When I talk about us as GIZ, I mainly refer to us or to the team I work for, which is the Sectoral Program for Anti-Corruption and Integrity. And we are located in Bonn, Germany. Our main mandate is to implement the strategy, which means we try to mainstream the topic of anti-corruption into all other topics that are relevant for development, such as infrastructure, climate financing, gender, and of course many others. The plate gets bigger by the day. The way we work is to provide experts of the other sectors with our anti-corruption expertise in the easiest form for them. We try to understand their processes to analyze corruption risk in their work and provide concrete recommendations in a digestible form. This year, we also started to work more intensively on the topic of corruption, of democracy, sorry. However, democracy is not just one topic as all the others. Democracy is more an umbrella of topics which sometimes makes it difficult to pin down what we're actually working on because it can become very vague if we talk about democracy. And it comes with a whole range of possibilities on how to approach this topic. We and our team at GIZ approach it mainly by putting integrity in its center. Integrity is right at the heart of democracy because it is the only way to create trust, and trust is the most important ingredient in a democracy. And this approach brought us to the topic of this panel today. Democratic backsliding is often put into connection with the erosion of trust. The erosion of trust from the citizens into their government, into the private sector and the media, or even into the society as a whole. And in that context, information plays a crucial role. Polarized communities often use very different sources of information. Disinformation and fake news are heavily debated topics. Information in its various forms is more and more often used as a political instrument and can be used to promote or to erode democracy. In this panel today, we want to look at the connection between democracy and anti-corruption, and both of these topics are joined by the topic of integrity. And we want to put a special focus on the topic of information in its various forms. I want to give a big thank you to all our speakers that are joining us today, and I'm sure we will enjoy a very interesting and fruitful discussion between them, and I hope that you as audience will also engage in that. And with that, I give the word to our moderator, Eduardo Núñez, who will take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jasna, for the introduction. Thanks for our panelists to be here with us. We are living in a time where basic agreements on democracy and human rights are being lost. This is the case in multiple countries and regions, and it's reflected in the evident crisis of the international system. In the debate about the present and future of democracy, we need analytical frameworks of reference. As the political scientist, Argentinian political scientist Gerardo Monks points out, we need to identify the challenge of democracy and the challenge for democracy. It's not the same. It's not the same. A difference, and it's important to be clear about this difference. The first one is related to the design and functioning of political regimes. The second one, to the demand for effectiveness in addressing specific problems in our societies. In this second category of challenges, for example, corruption, organized crime, disinformation, polarization play a central role. When corruption becomes systematic, it leads to institutional degradation and, under specific circumstances, to institutional cooptation, kleptocracy, and autocracy. In this context, this workshop looks to promote greater debate on the relationship between corruption, polarization, disinformation, and democracy crisis around the world. In most positive way, or form to say it, in other words, how can we build a virtuous relationship between anti-corruption efforts, the combat of disinformation, and the strengthening of democracy? That is our framework to our conversation in the next minutes. Let me put some rules on the table for the panel. The panel is organized in 2 rounds of intervention for our 4 panelists. The first one, to better understand the relationship between the challenge of democracy and the fight against corruption, going deep into perspectives and experiences on how our countries are managing those challenges. The second round will be focused on what is working on from the perspective of civil society to address those challenges. For each round, each panelist will have 5 minutes to present. After the round, we'll open the space for the public participation. Now, let me introduce briefly our panelists. Maria José Veramendi is the Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Officer at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Karam Singh is the Executive Director of Corruption Watch, the South African TI chapter, of my left. Eduardo Salcedo, right of the panel, is the founder and director of Vortex Foundation in Colombia and ACI Vortex Corporation in the United States of America. And Khushbu Agrawal is the advisor for money in politics at International IDEA. Okay, let's begin. For the first round, the conversation will be around the following general questions. What are the main challenges of and for democracies, and how we are dealing with those challenges? Also, in what ways does corruption threaten democracy and its institution? And what remedies are at the disposal of democracy to confront those challenges? Okay. Ms. Agrawal, you have the floor for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. First of all, It's a pleasure to join this illustrious panel. Thank you for inviting me. Before I answer the question, I would like to give you a little bit background of what International IDEA does. We are an intergovernmental organization. We are dedicated to promotion, protection, and advancing sustainable democracies worldwide. We combine policy-relevant knowledge production with capacity development projects and convening of dialogues on issues related to democracy. One of the ways in which we support this mandate is through assessing the quality of democracy, and this work culminates into the production of our annual report, which is called Global States of Democracy. So Jasna mentioned, and you also mentioned about the challenges that democracies are confronting, and this report, the last version, which was published in 2023, November, provides a little bit of a sobering picture. The 2023 report found that more countries have been experiencing declines in the quality of their democracies than the number of countries that have been experiencing positive developments. Most disturbingly, the report also shows that there is a systemic erosion of checks and balances that are formally tasked with upholding the laws and holding politicians to account, such as elections, parliaments, courts, etc., which has impacted really the quality of representation, rule of law, and rights, which have been threatened all across the globe. And it's not a phenomenon we are observing just in one region or a specific continent. It's a phenomenon that we have observed everywhere. So I give you this context because while the picture is very sobering and very forbidding, there are some room for hope. Particularly, their last report focused on the power of countervailing institutions. What is a countervailing institution? We chunk them into two categories, governmental and non-governmental. So these are, this could be both formal institutions, like they are within the systems of the government, but with independent mandate, like anti-corruption bodies, electoral management bodies, oversight agencies, etc. But also the report focuses a lot on the non-governmental bodies, which are civil societies, faith-based organizations, popular protest and mobilization. So to jump into the conversation about civil society, the report very, very strongly found that civil society organizations all around the world, despite the level of decline in democracy, together with other formal countervailing institutions, have been able to provide checks and balances against abuse of power and protecting and strengthening democracy in the most challenging times. So this really showed us that we have a lot of work to be done in terms of the qualities of democracies, but at the same time, we have institutions that are working really hard. We have citizen movements, we have citizen bodies and organizations that are fighting the fight and are not being complacent with the status quo. I work particularly on the issue of political finance, and while there is nothing inherently wrong with political parties receiving and spending money, but political finance really is a very easy entry point for illicit funding to enter into political domain. And civil society organizations all over the world have actually been working on making political funding transparent and making political parties more accountable all across the globe. And particularly on the issues of political financing, their work has been around whether it is analyzing political parties' reports, in identifying whether or not they are complying with political finance legislation. In some cases, civil society organizations have also engaged in civic education campaigns, for example, in terms of educating them on the perils of vote buying, because vote buying exists because vote selling exists. And civil society organizations have also been engaged in doing advocacy work and recommending state agencies on the kinds of reforms that could potentially be incorporated to make party funding more transparent. I have three examples I would like to give on what kind of work civil society organizations have been doing in this space. And the first one I would like to bring to your attention is the one one from Colombia. So in Colombia, there is this online reporting and disclosure system of political party funding, which is called Cuentas Claras. And it's one-of-a-kind system that is not implemented everywhere, very much existing in Europe, a little bit in Latin America, but the rest of the world is yet to adopt it. So this system allows political parties and candidates to report on their incomes and sources of funding through the digital portal, which can then eventually be disclosed to the public, which provides them real-time information on where the money is coming from, where the money is going. And I share this with you because actually Cuentas Claras was a system designed by a civil society organization in Colombia, Transparencia por Colombia, and it was eventually donated and adopted by the oversight agencies, the electoral management body in Colombia. So this is one aspect where a civil society organization took the initiatives to make political party funding transparent, which it wasn't in the past, and then and eventually they worked with the state body to make it publicly available and make it part of the institutional system. The second case I would like to highlight is Latvia. In Latvia, civil society organizations have been very active in monitoring campaign financing and just observing what are the new trends that are occurring in this space and what the gaps are. For 2018 elections, it was a civil society's initiative when they realized that there is a potential for foreign interference in election, and the state agencies were actually not prepared for that. And as a result of the initiative by civil society organization, a coordination committee was formed, and as a result, there was a lot of conversations happening with social media platform in terms of their algorithm, a spread of misinformation, disinformation, and just preparing the state bodies to be prepared for the onslaught of any foreign interference that might have happened in the election. And finally, the case of India, and many of you may be following what happened in India, and I think this is one of the most recent and one of the most remarkable examples of what civil society organizations can achieve. So in India in 2018, the government led by PM Narendra Modi instituted a scheme of electoral bonds, which allowed anybody to buy an electoral bond from the State Bank of India and deposit it in the banks of political party accounts. They were completely anonymous. Nobody could figure out how much money was donated, by whom it was donated, to who it was donated, and this continued for 6 years. It was a civil society organization called Association of Democratic Reforms that filed a petition in the Supreme Court even before the bonds were actually formalized, right after the bonds were announced, because they immediately realized how scrupulous it was and the potential that it had to make influence of big money on elections. They continued the fight for 6 years, and although there were many hurdles, on 15th February 2024, this year, the Supreme Court actually made electoral bond unconstitutional because it impinged on the rights of information of Indian nationals and did not give them the information to be able to make an informed choice for elections. So this was something that was truly remarkable. The State Bank of India was instructed to provide every single detail of every single electoral bond that was purchased from the bank and who it was deposited to, who deposited it, in what denomination was it deposited. So it of course did not possibly change the election results because the incumbent government still won the election, but it did give them an opportunity to actually analyze how much money was being funneled into election and from what kind of corporate bodies, including those who are on paper making losses, and even those who had some criminal cases against them. So I'll leave it there, and then we will come back to it later.
Thank you. Mr. Salcedo?
Okay, Eduardo, thank you so much. So for me, the challenges of democracy, the most important challenge for me, it is to survive in a very complex world. As we get more connected as society, more information flows across our world. And please, I need the screening. And what does it mean to survive in a more complex world? It means that, for example, changes happen faster. It means that we know so far that information flows faster. And it means that the world and the society is more difficult to understand and to predict. So, for example, I was looking at the content of the workshops from the last few days, and I know you can see that the agenda, the anti-corruption agenda, today looks very different of what it was 20 or 10 years ago. We feel that we have to also, that when we speak about anti-corruption, we also have to speak about climate change. For example, we need to speak about political funding. We need to speak about money laundering. So several factors come into play right now when we think about anti-corruption. So that's why civil society, and we'll discuss more about why not the governments are taking that lead about trying to understand complexity. So that's why civil society has to stand up to that challenge. So to give you an idea about what that corruption means, just to tell you, I direct a research institute, a research group, and since 2011, we focus on developing science, methodology, and technology for understanding the complexity of the crime happening right now in the world. So that means understanding the complexity of criminal networks and specifically about criminal networks of corruption, of transnational corruption happening. So let's see very quickly what I mean by when I speak about complexity. We have the idea, we have the traditional, the regular idea that corruption is about the public and the private sector, and that bribes are the most important forms of interaction. But when we pay attention to the empirical data and when we use the technology available to make sense of that huge amount of data that we can analyze, we can see that corruption and networks of not only corruption, traditional corruption, but co-option, networks that use and that reconfigure states, not only are articulated through bribe, for example. So the first relationship that we need to, the first characteristic that we need to understand of that complexity is the diversity. So the networks of corruption that we need to understand and to confront nowadays are a lot more diverse. They consist, as I was saying, not only of the private and the public sector, but as you know, we have to understand the role of lawyers, of victims, of banks, experts on money laundering, thousands and thousands of companies, shell companies. So for example, here we are looking at the Lavallato structure. Some of you may know, Lavallato is for many analysts the most important case of transnational corruption. 11 of the most powerful companies in Brazil got together to form a cartel to capture all the most important contracts, the public tenders. And trying to understand how those companies, how those public servants, how everyone was involved by just paying attention at the data. In that time, in 2017, by working with the Lavallato task force from Brazil, we were able to create this model, this network model with around 700 people, individuals and companies that were used around the world. And when I see around the world, I want to use this example to call the attention about the level of complexity, of transnational complexity that we need to understand when we speak about transnational corruption. So, Give me 1 second, please. Please stay with me, because I want to show you how this network looks at the transnational level. I think we'll make that in the second round, but before closing, I want to jump to what, for me, is the worst case of corruption and the most complex network of corruption. As some of you know, in Venezuela nowadays, the world is leading what, for me, is the worst criminal gang of the world, in the sense that we have a network structure that controls not only a government, but a complete state. And here, in this case, we are looking at the shell companies that the network of corruption has established around the world for purposes of money laundering. So this is just the information about more than 7,000 companies located around the world, created shell companies to launder the money that is extracted from Venezuela. Let's leave it right there, and then we can dig a little bit more in the second round.
Thank you. Mr. Singh.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank again the organizers of this panel. There's some magic words in the title of this panel that I'd like to ask the audience to reflect upon. One is autocracy, the other is resiliency, the other is civil society and democracy. And I think if we apply these terms to the countries that we come from, we'll come up with different types of analyses. The question that I'm seeking to answer in this input is, how resilient has the South African democracy been, and particularly how resilient has it been as regards to the fight against corruption? I think it's important to note that we've just had democratic elections in South Africa. South Africa is not in a situation where it's sliding into an autocratic situation, but by no means is the democracy perfected, and there are many weaknesses. The issue of resiliency is a subjective concept, and depending on how you look at it, you may come to different conclusions. I want to focus on a couple of aspects of South Africa's post-apartheid legal framework and the role played by civil society in the wake of the mass democratic movement that defeated apartheid. Resiliency in the South African fight against corruption has been aided by an active civil society, by a robust human rights framework grounded in democratic principles, in a democratic constitution, in a legitimate judiciary, and a justiciable Bill of Rights. The democratic transition from apartheid was accelerated after 1994 with the first non-democratic elections that saw Nelson Mandela become president and the creation of a government of national unity. 30 years later, we've just had elections where the ANC has now lost its supermajority, and again we find ourselves back in a situation of a coalition government of national unity. In 1996, the democratic constitution was agreed critically based upon international democratic best practices and a full set of civil and political rights and socio-economic rights, including the right to information. The justiciability of South Africa's Bill of Rights has been instrumental in advancing democratic rights and freedoms, with significant contestation around the content of these rights being tested in the courts and the emergence of a constitutional jurisprudence from the Constitutional Court. Examples of this include the declaration that the death penalty was unconstitutional and critical cases around the right to housing and the right to health care. One of the most significant cases was the 2002 judgment in the case of the Minister of Health versus the Treatment Action Campaign. The Treatment Action Campaign was a broad-based civil society movement that sought to give content to the right to health by saying that government had an obligation to provide antiretroviral treatment to those suffering with HIV. And this was a successful. Government had resisted this on the basis that it was not something that it could afford to do. And this case was absolutely critical in leading to the universal rollout, first in terms of mother-to-child transmission of HIV, and then universal rollout of antiretrovirals. Looking at the issue of anti-corruption, there have also been significant constitutional court cases around the issue of what is South Africa's constitutional obligation to fight corruption. And there were 3 critical cases named after the chief litigant, Hugh Glenister, Glenister 1, 2, and 3. In the Glenister litigation, the applicant challenged the legal basis upon which one of South Africa's anti-corruption agencies, the Directorate of Special Operations, also known as the Scorpions, was disbanded. There's a whole political backstory to how the Scorpions were disbanded, but in summary, the Scorpions were beginning to bite, they were becoming effective, and it became official ANC policy that the Scorpions should be disbanded. We're still living with the consequences of that fateful decision, and this was a key move that set the scene for what became a period of state capture in South Africa from a period of 2009 roughly to 2017. In summary, the Glenister litigation, through the Glenister litigation, the Constitutional Court found that based upon an interpretation of South Africa's Bill of Rights and various international law obligations, including being a signatory to the UNCAC, that South Africa was obliged to create an independent anti-corruption fighting unit. This context is important to understand that there has been significant resiliency within the South African polity and within the legal democratic framework to advance rights. However, this has not been sufficient. Nearly a decade after the Glenister litigation, for instance, the debate still goes on around what is the appropriate institutional architecture to fight corruption. We now have a National Advisory Council Against Corruption, a structure created by the National Anti-Corruption Strategy to advise the president, and it's seized with these very questions today. After recent democratic elections that have resulted in a coalition government, there clearly now is an opportunity to push forward the anti-corruption agenda and accelerate progress, particularly on this issue of the institutional architecture. The moment also provides us with an opportunity to raise critical questions relating to enhanced whistleblower protection and support, reform of the public procurement system to ensure that it's more transparent and less vulnerable to petty, grand corruption and state capture. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. And to end this first round, Ms. Beramendi.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the GIZ for the opportunity to participate in this panel and to have the opportunity to share with you this conversation. From the point of view of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the question that I will seek to answer in this first intervention is, how do anti-corruption and democratic values connect from a human rights perspective? And we know that corruption is a major challenge for democracy and for human rights. And the efforts to combat corruption are essential to safeguard both democratic institutions and human rights. They are all interconnected. And in fact, member states, when in the preamble of UNCAC, they expressed their serious concern about undermining the institutions and values of democracy, ethical values, and justice, and jeopardizing sustainable development and the rule of law. OHCHR has been working on the nexus between corruption and human rights for many years, but for the past 2 years, we have been developing a strategy for our work on anti-corruption and human rights. And it's important to understand why are we stepping up this work on anti-corruption and human rights. And it's because corruption deepens inequalities and has a destructive effect on the ability of states to respect, protect, fulfill human rights, particularly of persons and communities in situations of vulnerability and marginalization. But it also impacts the ability of the state to fulfill their human rights obligations and to use their maximum available resources to fulfill human rights and to fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights, human rights as a whole. But corruption does not only cripple public budgets that would allow for them to use their maximum available resources to fulfill human rights, it also destroys public confidence in government, judicial institutions, elections, in democratic institutions as a whole. And this was highlighted by the Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda report, in which he noted the decay in trust in public institutions and that this is undermining the social contract. In fact, Our Common Agenda report demanded or reflected on the importance of a renewed social contract and a new global deal to support that social contract, and that is part of the 2030 agenda. So what are we doing? This is why we need to step up our work. Why did we decide to step up our work on anti-corruption and human rights? What are we doing? OHCHR is advocating for a human rights-based approach to anti-corruption and calls for a comprehensive set of measures to combat. This includes promoting effective institutions, appropriate laws, policy measures, good governance, justice, and very importantly, redress for victims, and participation of all concerned stakeholders. We were speaking about the importance of participation and the role of civil society. The participation of civil society and the support to those who combat corruption and the space that they operate within with security. Our work places corruption at the center of our vision and our strategy. And we are doing this in 3 ways. The first one is by moving towards a more holistic human rights-based approach to anti-corruption efforts at the country level. A human rights lens can help shift towards a preventive approach that promotes democracy, trust and trusting relationships and practices in society between individuals, institutions, decision makers, and brings justice and redress for victims and does not stop short at law enforcement. The second is by supporting victims to ensure their access to justice. A human rights-based approach can help put a greater focus on victims and their right to obtain redress. And the third one, which is very, very key, is by promoting greater coherence and cross-fertilization of anti-corruption and human rights policy discussions. We need to break the silos and enhance policy coherence. The latest resolution of the Human Rights Council on the negative impact of corruption in the enjoyment of human rights highlighted the importance of policy coherence among intergovernmental processes in Geneva, Vienna, and New York on the issue on how corruption impacts negatively human rights. The cases that were described before by the fellow panelists show the link between either corruption undermining democracy and human rights very clearly, but also how can human rights be effective guardrails to protect democracy and to combat corruption. In the countries most affected by corruption, corruption is a means of state capture and authoritarian consolidation. Corruption networks operate at all levels and involve criminal networks, in some cases the private sector, vast amount of money, of public assets, and involve, in some cases, high-level officials. Electoral and justice systems are weakened, with no accountability, and independent voices are silenced, leaving further behind people and communities in situations of vulnerability and marginalization who are also denied and lack access to public services. In others, the fight against corruption is instrumentalized to silence the opposers. In others, weak integrity systems allow for large sums of money of illicit flows that remain stalled, hidden in banks, damaging entire societies and democratic institutions. Responses to these challenges will be more effective when they integrate human rights as guardrails, as well as the good governance principles of transparency, responsibility, accountability, participation, and responsiveness. We must remember that in all of this conversation of the links between anti-corruption, democracy, and human rights, there are victims behind, and that should be the center also of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to the second round of interventions. And in this moment, the conversation will try to respond to a main general question. What is the role of information when it comes to anti-corruption and democratic protection? But I can address more specific questions for each one of you. Ms. Agrawal, how can civil society leverage the power to information to protect democracy from evil actors?
Thank you. That's a very good question and a very perfect continuation of our conversations from round one. And I also feel like there are two layers to this question. I mean, it's very, very basic and known to all. Information really gives the power to anybody to take action. So that obviously is there, that information allows and supports the work of protection of democracy from malign actors. But then there is another layer, which we call now information pollution. We have talked about disinformation, we have talked about misinformation, foreign manipulation, and all of this is happening while we are also talking about the power of information. But when the information is used for malign purposes, it beats the very foundation of democratic systems. So I just want to give you a little bit context of what we have been doing recently. At International IDEA, we just started implementation of a project with support from Global Affairs Canada, for which we are very, very grateful. And the project basically is trying to increase the capacity of civil society actors to fulfill their democratic role in countering foreign information, manipulation, and interference. So the premise on which we have built this project is that despite the numerous safeguards that countries and bodies are trying to incorporate, foreign actors, malign actors will always be one step ahead, and they will find ways to manipulate and impose narratives into domestic politics, trying to influence elections and the democratic system as a whole. And these foreign-led actors, however, get entangled with national dynamics and actors. In addition, they anchor their actions in context-based enablers and incentives that we call of political, legal, or financial nature. So untangling those relationships and understanding what type of enablers and incentives facilitate the success of election-related disinformation is, we believe, at the core of countering it and building more resilient democracies. But it is not easy. These enablers, who are those enablers? Particularly, what are the financial enablers behind information manipulation? It's not really easy, especially when those enablers have conflicting and sometimes maybe complementary purposes. For example, foreign actors may use the misinformation being spread by opposition to ride on the bandwagon, or domestic actors or opposition actors may use foreign information manipulation to seep into the domestic narratives. So it's really difficult. And at the same time, we must all reflect on the financial incentives that goes behind the spread of misinformation. Very simplistically, somebody who is a social media influencer could potentially use sensational information to get clickbaits and to make money out of it. Because if you go onto YouTube and just type any kind of phrase on information manipulation, you will enter a rabbit hole, because there are actors who are resharing, creating content completely untrue, but because this algorithm is allowing them to use that content to monetize their own network. So what we are trying to do is create tools that will allow civil society actors to actually identify these enablers and use those enablers to create more resilient societies. So while foreign information manipulation or any kind of disinformation from malign actors will continue to happen, the end goal is to create societies that become resilient to those kind of information manipulation. So there are three different pillars to the work that we are trying to do. The first is, of course, creating tools that can help civil society identify the legal, financial, political enablers. Second, use that information to now go and sensitize citizenry on how they can keep themselves immune to the information manipulation that's happening around that space. And finally, for the civil society actors and policymakers to sit together and use that information to now create policies, legislation, strategies, safeguards that will eventually curtail any kind of manipulation that's happening in online and offline spaces. So I'll leave it at there, but we'll be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Salcedo, what are essential actions that civil society organization can adopt to embrace and use the power of current information technologies?
Thank you, because that goes perfectly well what the points that you were discussing. Because as I was saying before, the civil society organizations today have a unique role in understanding this complexity and using the most cutting-edge technologies for making sense of the huge amount of data that we can access and that we can compute today. Unfortunately, the private sector obviously focuses on the profits, and as you were saying, they won't care about regulations or using these technologies for the greatest good of society. So I will need again, please, the screen. And on the other hand, the governments are way behind. So the civil society organizations have today a unique role to first to embrace these technologies, to make sense of the data, and to articulate the use of these tools between the governments and to bring the cutting edge that the private sector creates, to bring those technologies into this agenda, into the agenda of anti-corruption and the agenda of creating more resilient democracies. From our side, for example, at Vortex, we have been creating this is a robot. The graphs that we were looking at before, all those graphs were handmade. It all consisted of researchers at our groups, reading the information, systematizing information, classifying everything. But now, for example, we are looking at a fully artificial intelligence robotic analysis that basically searches information, media information about these criminal markets that we see here. So Archon, which is the name of the robot, uses different ways, different artificial intelligence modules to search first information about several criminal markets. It downloads the information reads the information, reads the media sources, the articles, classify them according to the criminal market that we want to analyze. Arconal also classifies the dates, so we can see maybe here on the right lower side, you see this, this control here. This allows us to see the evolution of every criminal market that we want to analyze. And then another artificial intelligence analyzes the countries involved in the criminal action that is informed in the media, in the source. So each one of these dots, these nodes that you see here flowing, is actually a media source. It's an article. So, for example, we can just roll over one of these nodes, and we can see the analysis that the artificial intelligence is conducting to locate the countries where the illicit flows regarding human trafficking, drug trafficking, money laundering, where those illicit flows are moving from and to what country. So this, I wanted to show this just to give an idea of how, from the civil society perspective, we can use these technologies, these amazing technologies, not only artificial intelligence, but also traditional algorithms, to make sense of the huge amount of data that we can access today. Doing this is affordable, is expensive, but affordable. So I think that, as I was saying, this is a unique role and a unique time in which civil society can really play a critical role, an essential role, to understand that complexity, that messy flows of crime moving around the world that co-opt a state. As I was saying, in the case, for example, of Venezuela, not only a government, but an entire state, the judicial system, all the branches, all the public sectors are co-opted by one of these networks. So we need to really understand this complexity at this transnational level. I will again leave it right there. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you. Mr. Singh, how has Corruption Watch leveraged the access to information regime in South Africa and the use of data to empower citizens in the fight against corruption?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I spoke in the first part about the legal framework in South Africa which empowers the realization of rights, including the right to information. Corruption Watch was formed in about 2012 and then affiliated with Transparency International as the South African chapter. And I think up to a certain point was very traditional in some ways in terms of how it was organized and how it sought to promote an anti-corruption agenda. In recent years, we've given more thought to how we can breed content into strategic objectives around the promotion of active citizenry and the promotion of transparency. And this has led to the development of some digital tools that can assist citizens, officials, and others in civil society to engage government on anti-corruption and good governance. The one tool is called the VESA tool, which addresses issues of policing and public safety, and the other tool is called Procurement Watch. VESA is a colloquial term meaning to expose and is an interactive open data tool. After collecting years of whistleblower complaints on police corruption, as well as engaging communities around South Africa on their experiences of police violence and abuse, our team developed a tool that could potentially reduce the power imbalance that exists between the South African Police Service and members of the public. The tool utilizes an open data platform with the goal of improving transparency and accountability of the police. We understand the need to find innovative solutions to address the culture of corruption within the police, which often allows police officers to abuse their power and operate under a veil of secrecy. So what does the tool allow its users to do? It allows users to report incidents of police corruption and police misconduct, to access interactive maps of police corruption trends and hotspots, to access information relating to citizen rights when they encounter the police, to access information on over 1,000 police stations across the country relating to their location, their resources, their budgets, and their personnel, to locate the nearest family violence, child protection, and sexual offenses units, to rate and review police stations based upon people's personal experiences, and to nominate honest and ethical police officers based upon people's experience. You can find the tool, it's veza.org.za. The second tool that we've developed is a tool called Procurement Watch. As we know, public procurement is the single largest procurement risk, particularly in developing countries. This was flagged very clearly in the South African State Capture Commission, where public procurement was seen as particularly vulnerable to state capture and kleptocracy. Transparency International estimates that governments in low and middle income countries spend up to 50% of public funds buying goods and services from the private sector. So what does the Procurement Watch tool does? It interrogates information which is published quarterly by the National Treasury relating to procurement deviations and procurement expansions. It provides data analytic tools to allow the users to interrogate the data. For instance, which public entities are in the top 10 when it comes to instances and amounts of procurement deviations and expansions. It utilizes a red flag methodology to identify instances and amounts, noting that such occurrences are not necessarily in themselves corruption, but indicative of possible irregular transactions worthy of further scrutiny and additional investigations. The tool also looks at the issue of the restricted supplier database, those suppliers who've been designated as having contravened previous procurement. The overall objectives of the project is to improve the ability to monitor procurement and contracting, to make procurement and contracting more transparent by presenting the data in a more readily searchable and understandable format. It's envisioned that the rollout of the tool will be able to utilize AI in the future to do predictive modeling on previous information to anticipate which public entities are vulnerable to these types of deviations and expansions. This may allow us to predict future poor audit outcomes. The rollout of the user group of the tool involves engagements with investigative journalists, and we've also now been engaging with various public entities, including the Auditor General of South Africa and the Special Investigating Unit, and they've taken a real interest in the tool. And we envision that we'll be able to roll out the tool to other public entities and expand that user group. The only concern being from my colleague who developed the tool is that there's skeletons in the data, and that could be weaponized by people who would want to use it for other purposes. So we're being quite cautious, but we do think that these are practical tools which can really provide content to this notion of what it means to be an active citizen. Thank you.
Thank you. And to close the panel, this second round, Ms. Beramendi, how does the right to information interplays with the fight against corruption and the protection of democracy?
Thank you. And I'll be brief. The right to information is essential. And the right to information is also tied to the important role that civil society has in this context. And civil society has a key role in anti-corruption efforts, and full, meaningful, and safe participation is essential across all areas of corruption, policy development, implementation, monitoring. But it's not only the access to information, it's what type of information, and not only the role of civil society, but the civic space, a safe and open civic space that allows civil society to participate effectively in this context. An open civic space is fundamental for dialogue and for mobilization. The access to information, not just any type of information, is extremely valuable, but it is when communities and people can actually openly advocate for change and hold governments accountable, that meaningful change can occur. And I want to end by also highlighting the importance of good governance and human rights in addressing the challenges that are posed by the digital age. And this is really important, as we spoke about also disinformation, also new tools that are being developed. And the role of good governance and human rights in this context includes transparency and decision-making around new technologies and open multi-stakeholder discussions on how to regulate its development. That is also fundamental in this context to protect human rights. And just as a final word, and again, in bringing the human rights-based approach to the conversation, the human rights-based approach seeks to break this vicious cycle in which corruption negatively impacts democracy and impacts human rights, to turn it into a virtuous cycle in which human rights constitute guardrails that safeguard democracy and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Great ideas to open to the public about questions, comments. The idea is to take 1 or 2 rounds or 2 or 3 interventions of the public, and later our panelists can answer or complement it. Please.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Halleck. I work at the Accountability Research Center at American University in Washington, D.C., and found this to be a very interesting panel, especially given the differences, I guess, in having the data side of things and the civil society side of things. And one question that comes up in my mind, especially based on my work, is how do we close the gap between these quality, user-centered focus on putting good data out there, whether it's on policing or procurement, and then civil society uptake of that information? There was a talk about engaged citizenry and making sure that they can have access to this information, so that's the first part, but then actually using it and mobilizing it in ways to generate accountability would be my question that I think all 4 of you are probably well equipped to answer on, so it's not to anyone specific, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Another question, comment? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Maria Kolokolova. I present International Foundation for Electoral Systems, Ukraine. And my question is about this concept that intersect in this topic, and one that wasn't mentioned, about negative impact of corruption on democracy that leads to lack of trust, and this leads consequently to raising of populism, which is also goes hand in hand with corruption, as populists, they are often corrupt themselves, and they use this problem in society to get power. So in your opinion, what is the role of civil society organizations in combating this challenge of populism as a threat to democracy? And how can society be immune from populism by civil society organizations? Thank you.
Thank you. One last question or comment? If not, okay. Up to you.
You go?
Who wants? Okay.
And no, go ahead, and then I'll.
No, I just wanted to share some reflection on how do you take the data to the public, right? I am an optimist. I believe that citizens are much more knowledgeable and much more aware of the political surroundings and what is happening in that space. We've been working with a lot of countries on political finance, particularly where we're working with civil society organizations. We have seen positive developments in Albania, for instance. The issue of political finance has been so prominent, and civil society organizations are the ones who've been able to uptake that and take it back to the citizenry, like where are political parties getting the money from? We often tie the issue of political finance or corruption with trust, obviously. We don't really actually have hard data on how making political funding transparent actually leads to better trust or not. It's a lot of hypotheses that we are doing, but we continue to work on that hypothesis that political parties should do the right thing because it will eventually lead to better political trust, especially in a climate where especially young people are losing trust in politics. And it also ties to your question, Maria, on the issue of rise of populism and why these populist actors are able to take this lack of transparency or rise in corruption against the status quo, and but at the same time, I do believe that there's a lot of effort that is happening. Information itself is not powerful. What you do of that information, how you break down that information to the public, how it is actually related to them, and a lot of issues were raised by Maria, particularly on the issues of human rights and how abuse of resources can eventually lead to failure of governments to deliver services to the people. So even in the issue of political finance, if the money that is intended for the building of hospitals or building of schools is being abused by political parties for their own personal gain, it is going to lead to unfair consequences. And this is something that the public needs to know of why it matters for them. Why should they be concerned about political party financing or about corruption? And civil society can really bring it all together because they are the gateway to the civic spaces, to citizenry, and without information, analysis of that information and to the granular details, it's not possible. And the example of India that I provided is a good one because there was a lot of analysis on Indian citizens don't care about where political parties are receiving their money. That was the narrative that political actors were selling to everybody. They don't care. They only care about whether or not politicians are able to provide them with jobs or reduce poverty or provide education. But eventually, it does matter to them. It may not have skewed the political competition, but it matters to them. The amount of attention that the issue of electoral bonds raised in India was remarkable, and it is primarily because civil society, media, and other actors were able to take that information. Okay, who was donating to political parties? Oh, this random lottery guy who used to sell lottery tickets, multimillionaire, was donating huge amounts of money to political party, and he was at the same time reporting losses in his financial statements. So it is important to have this kind of dynamic where everybody does their act. Political parties does the right thing because it is eventually going to lead to trust, although it is not researched, but that's the hypothesis we believe in. And at the same time, civil society just, bringing it all together and letting the citizens know the information they deserve to know.
Yes. So getting back to the questions and what you are saying, it's essential to close the gap by boosting the discussion between civil society, private sector, and governments. Unfortunately, the gap right now is huge. It's crazy. It's really, really crazy. I mean, on one side, the private sector is discussing, for example, what to do when a second-grade artificial intelligence creates a first-grade artificial intelligence and we don't understand what they are talking about. That's the type of discussions that are ongoing right now in the private sector. In the civil society sector, we are just trying to understand what artificial intelligence is and how to use it. And the governments, on the other hand, they don't even participate in. I mean, in Europe, there are some regulations, some discussion about how to regulate, but for example, in Latin America, this discussion doesn't even exist right now. So we have three different worlds of society right now going on. So we do need to close that gap by boosting the discussion. I mean, we need to have discussions between civil society organizations that can use these tools, the private sector, especially the most important corporations that have right now the most powerful large language models, the most powerful artificial intelligence models, which can be super easily right now and will be easily weaponized for the purposes of populism, for example. We have had to deal with kleptocrats, with dictatorships, with populists for a long time. That's very part of the human mind. But the problem is that right now, those populists will have at their disposal the most amazing technologies, not only to disseminate information, but to create information. Right now, as you know, most of us, we are already related to ChatGPT, for example, and we know that ChatGPT and other large language models, they basically create, they hallucinate, we say. Those populists in the short term, like right now, for example, in India, the elections were full of fake videos or of fake speeches that were almost impossible to distinguish. So let's imagine for a second what will happen in 5 or 10 years when that is the common law, when that is the common way of developing elections in Latin America, for example, when the public cannot really differentiate between a real speech and a fake speech. So specifically because of that, we do need to boost the discussion, especially around AI. I mean, artificial intelligence, for the good or for the bad, is the most powerful information tool that we have today, and we do need to understand it.
Karam?
In response to the first question from a colleague from Accountability Research Center, I think the right to information and the fight for greater transparency cannot be an end in itself, right? And what we sit with in the South African context is this real accountability deficit. So I'll give you the example of state capture and the State Capture Commission. We had a 4-year commission of inquiry into state capture. The judge that presided over the commission, Judge Zondo, said that if he were to have investigated every allegation of state capture that was brought to the commission, it would have taken the commission 10 years. It was initially thought that the commission would finish its work in about a year. The commission took 4 years with an additional year to write the report because it wasn't issuing interim reports. So the public was gripped in the first year and a half of the commission. It was on public radio, it was on the TV, all sorts of salacious stuff was coming out. And then there was this kind of fatigue, and this kind of, and people didn't really necessarily want to hear it all. Once the report was issued, thousands of pages, hundreds of findings and recommendations, and you have a government who is implicated, doesn't have a good record on corruption, who are now tasked with actioning these findings and recommendations. There's all sorts of work being done behind the scenes. There's work being done on policy development, there's work being done on legislation, there's further investigations that are taking place, but there's no public messaging on this because it's not a winning issue for the government. So then I get called to do media interviews or go to a conference to say, what's government doing with these findings and recommendations? And I've got to now kind of try to access my contacts in government to say, what are you guys doing? You know, and then I publicize it, but that's not my role, you know. So it is a real conundrum. I think the emphasis has to come back to civil society. We have a real obligation to play in terms of how we message, how we're responsible, but our reach is limited, you know, you know, it's a real challenge to close that accountability deficit. So while the Commission of Inquiry was an absolute victory for transparency, with limited asset recovery, with few prosecutions for state capture, it remains to be seen whether it's a victory for accountability.
Maria Jose?
Yeah, just to add up on what the other panelists have mentioned, transparency, accountability, access to information are definitely essential for the fight against corruption. And at the same time, what Eduardo was explaining highlights again the need and the importance of good governance and human rights in the context of the digital age and the new tools that are being developed. And also I think what we saw on the panel today and the tools that were presented highlights the important role that civil society is having into developing these tools and making them available for use of the general population. Because we also have to recall that although we are living in this digital age, there is an important amount of the population that remains on the other side of the digital divide. Last year, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on good governance in the promotion and protection of human rights. And the resolution mandated OHCHR to organize a panel on good governance in the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of bridging the digital divide. And we held a panel discussion. I believe Karen participated in that panel discussion last year mandated by the Human Rights Council. And what this showed is that while the pandemic brought this surge of provision of public services through digital technologies, it also, in some cases, deepened inequalities and surfaced the issue of more than half of the population being on the other side of the digital divide. So it is important to highlight the role that civil society organizations are having in this context and making this tool available, and also highlighting the responsibility of the state that includes the bridging of the digital divide and making access to information, transparency, and accountability available to all.
Thank you. One last question. He's coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Michel Roland from Ecuador. Now I'm working in El Salvador with the International Cooperation. And I want to take back your words, Eduardo, at the beginning, the challenge of democracy, the challenge for democracy. First of all, I have been working with TI, with IDEA, with UN in different projects around the world. I'm a big fan of course, of those institutions. But I want to ask you the following question. Democracy without the levers is not a democracy for me. And we have been discussing about that for the last 25, 30 years, I suppose, when we come back and we see the falling of Berlin Wall in 1989. So the Democrats must be thinking about how the autocrats are linked with the populations, why they are winning in spaces, in different places around the world. maybe the Democrats, we have to think how we can connect with the people again, how maybe we need to think out of the box to understand how we can connect with those people, how we can offer public policies, effective public policies in health, in education, in transparency. So it's a question that I want to share with all the participants, how we can improve democracy thinking out of the box. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we can take advantage of the last question because it's a very good question to close the panel with one last reflection of each one of you. Karam?
It's a big question. It's a real challenge. If I reflect, I've been speaking about the South African case study. So we've had 30 years now of post-democracy in South Africa. We've had incremental victories on certain issues, certain rights-based issues. I spoke about the universal rollout of antiretrovirals. What democracy hasn't delivered in South Africa is an equal society. What democracy hasn't delivered in South Africa is a pathway for young people to feel that they can enter the economy. We have a stagnant economy, we have structural unemployment, and so the fundamental challenges. And going back to the question around populism, this then becomes the kind of feeding ground through which populists can weaponize and exploit. So you can have the best constitution, you can have these formal rights, but if it's not linked to a tangible economic emancipation, to a vision of the future, then it's in many ways some of the democratic victories can be hollow and can be the basis upon which autocrats can mobilize. And it's obviously quite concerning now to sort of observe what's happening in Europe, with the recent elections and the rise of... So I do think that progressive forces, democratic, those who are on the side of democracy, I'm not answering your question, but to go back to your question, have to begin to re-message and rethink how they can now make the connection, particularly with the youth, about what the value proposition is of a real democracy. Thank you.
It's a very, very difficult question, and there is no one size-fit-all answer to that. And I started my presentation with the analysis of democracy, and the International Idea has been collecting that data. So definitely democracies are in decline. But at the same time, as our Secretary General Kevin Casas, he likes to say, it is the best system because it at least gives you the opportunity to throw the rascals out in the next elections. But of course, people are getting impatient, young people particularly, and I think, although you mentioned the case of South Africa, it is actually a universal problem because young people everywhere are feeling unrepresented in the political systems in their respective countries. And it was also alluded in our report, the biggest challenges that democracy are facing are in terms of fundamental rights, which are being curtailed all around the world, in terms of checks and balances, institutional checks and balances, and also just credible elections. And even when elections are credible, the amount of attacks that are receiving from external forces, which makes people not believe in election or election authorities, and it has happened from Mexico to Brazil to even India recently. So obviously, again, there is no one answer to that, but at the same time, we must strive for a democracy that is inclusive, that is representative, and that upholds the citizens' right to all kinds of freedom of speech and information, etc. And particularly, I think young people have to be at the center of whatever is being done in this space, because and it is not just about bringing young people to the polling booth. It's really making them feel heard and represented in political systems.
Maria Jose?
I think we're all going to tell you that it's a very difficult question. But of course, I don't have the answer, but I like the idea of thinking outside the box. I think that some years ago, we wouldn't have thought that we would be in an anti-corruption conference speaking about human rights, and now we're here. So thinking out of the box renders important results. I would just say, highlight the importance of breaking the silos and partnerships. I think this is fundamental. We need to connect the communities. We need to connect the different constituencies, youth, migrants, older persons, indigenous peoples. We need to connect the constituencies and the communities. And I believe these partnerships and the shared responsibility. I was speaking before about this important role that civil society is having in developing these tools, but with this important role, there is a great responsibility attached to it on which information is shared and disseminated to the public. So I would say partnerships and breaking the silos is fundamental to move forward.
Eduardo.
So yes, very difficult question, and I would like to try to answer that question with a quote by Edward Osborne Wilson, the father of social biological analysis. And he says in one of his books that we humans have godlike technology, Paleolithic emotions, and medieval institutions. And that the gap between each of those elements gets more and more dangerous as the changes occur faster in our world. So I think that for democracy, or at least one form of democracy to survive this super fast evolving society, we need to try to close the gap between those elements, between our institutions, our technology, and our emotions as humans.
Colleagues, thanks a lot for all the rich reflections on democracy challenges, anti-corruption efforts, and a review, I think, on what is working on from the civil society side to address those challenges. Democracy, as all we know, is an ongoing construction project, always changing. Each time brings risk and challenges, but also brings opportunities, as we describe in this panel. Today we have reflected on both the challenge, but also the ways to respond to them. I think the evidence shared the panel is we have models, we have approaches, we have methodologies, and we have tools, and that works in several countries and several regions. But we need to remember always one basic democratic principle. There is no democracy without democrats. And there are no democrats without genuine participation in public affairs. I think this is our main area of work. That is our task, and of course, is our responsibility. Many thanks for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.